Welcome guys to an episode with the Doomed Hell. So I've been enjoying making these last couple videos, so I decided to, give a shot at another topic, something a little bit more nerdy. And for those of you that thought I was a huge nerd, I mean, you're gonna friggin' regret it because I'm gonna blow your mind with how nerdy I could get. So in this video, we're going to be making a last-ditch effort to defend the FX CPU lineup. Now, FX is going on over 20 years, over 10 years old now, and it is now really suffering in terms of gaming because it just doesn't support some of the newer, what would you call that? Some of the newer instruction sets, such as like SSC 2.0. Is it called SSC? I don't remember, but there's this one instruction set that we now use a lot more. It might be AVX. I think that's what I'm thinking of, AVX2. And yeah, this one just doesn't support it, and because of that, it's really been struggling. But people don't understand that when most gamers hate on FX CPUs, it really comes from a mentality and distinction within the gaming community that is more so about like let's call it sociology, more so this kind of like tribal logic, not so much the actual objective truth. Here I'm going to defend and actually predict that in the near future we're going to be looking at FX CPUs very fondly, and that's mostly because FX was actually a powerhouse. It gave a lot of performance for consumers that wanted a quick upgrade, that wanted a good platform for the next couple of years, and it gave no bullshit, which was something that Intel started way early on during their Core I history. And so I'm just going to go through kind of some of the reasons why the CPU was so powerful and kind of some of the controversies that happened during its early lifespan that, tainted the face of FX forever. So let's look at this thread first. This is a thread where it pretty much sums up the subjective memory kind of beliefs that gamers at that point were really dealing with. So the first thing is that a lot of gamers were, keep in mind, like I started gaming when FX really came into being. These people, this is about 6 years ago, these people were gaming when the original FX had come out, or when the original FX were still having a taint on the community. And so because of that, FX already had kind of a namesake. It was really the competitor to the high-end Pentium 4s that were of the early 2000s, or actually mid-2000s era. So already we have that kind of persona for the FX nameplate, and there's a lot of good things that were out of this kind of generation of PC gaming. For one, it was a much cheaper hobby. For two, we cared a lot more about our wattage, about our power consumption. Now, there are good reasons why we no longer care about our power consumption, such as our bills are cheaper, but back then it was actually very important, and I think that it reflects with the hardware we had. Just look at the graphics cards back then. I would kind of rather go back to that kind of era. One thing that is noted here is that the CPUs were power hungry. The FX CPU was not a true octo-core. We're going to get into that. Actually, let me write it down right now here. Not true octo-core. And octo-core is an interesting word. We're going to get into that too. Back to here. Leftover CPUs. Oh, here, 2 billion transistors. We could go out on a limb and talk about that. So here it says that AMD flat out lied that the FX lineup had 2 billion transistors, when in fact it was closer to 1.2 billion. So let's check that is true. Here we have the tech power up forums, 1.2 billion. Okay, he's not wrong there, but I would argue that he is in fact wrong and he doesn't really understand why. So one thing that everyone should know about FX is that when it first came out, it was in fact a server-side solution that ended up becoming a desktop-side solution. So the FX lineup first came out as an Opteron CPUs, and then they just basically ported it out to the rest of their lineup. So even when Phenom was still pretty popular for gaming, this kind of solution, the FX solution, was already in production. And this is just to show you. Here we have Opteron 6274s, which are like right around the FX 8100 lineup, that right around that kind of date. Very, very cheap, and these had 2.4 billion transistors. So that's a lie, because basically how the FX CPUs came out was that they took these Opterons and they split it into half. So that's a misconception people don't understand. What else here? Here we talk about Phenom. We're gonna get into that. That's a fiasco that only really 2014, 2015 people really understood. And I mean that's around the age. Oh, actually this is a little older than that, but we're gonna get into that. And then here there's just a lot more of the same garbage. So let's kind of talk about it. I think that the objective factors here is that we have to look at it, on paper. So the first thing we're going to get into is the misconception of mid-range FX, which is mainly 4100 at first, and then 6100, and then later on the 6300, and the 8350s became mid-range right at the end there, but the 6300 is especially. So one big argument that people had with FX is that, well, first of all, they're not real cores, they're like half cores or whatever it may be, so you shouldn't even consider it that way. Then there was this whole bullshit about how there was like a lawsuit on the namesake, and people won it, and somehow that made people feel good about it. I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but just know that if you win a bit of money because because there's some sort of like false advertising, it doesn't mean the false advertising is 100% false. If you look at like how court cases works, you'd understand that they give you money because they don't want to deal with it in court. All right, that's pretty much the sum of that. They were too lazy to deal with it, so you're never gonna know if it's actually true. But we'll get into that in terms of like not true octa-core. But again, the Phenom 2 processors, the famous words was that the Phenom 2 processors, especially the X6s, competed directly with the FX 6000 CPUs, and so it didn't make sense for a lot of gamers that had Phenom 2 X6s to upgrade to FX 6100s. So that's a flat out lie. For one, the Phenom 2 X6s specifically were split into a lot of categories. The Phenom systems, I mean, if you guys didn't know, the Phenom systems really only overclocked to around like 3.9 gigahertz if you were lucky. And the Phenom architecture in general was just terrible for overclocking. It's a lot like Ryzen 1000 series, where you could only really give it like 300 megahertz more than its supposed core clock, and even then it would really struggle to give that that frequency at a decent voltage. It would just absolutely eat up voltage. That's actually one of the reasons why AM3 and AM3 Plus had come out. The 3 Plus basically, I mean, originally was for that upgrade path, but it also was a VRM thing right at the beginning. It was more of a motherboard manufacturing name that just got into the actual manufacturing name, so the actual CPU name. That shit's pretty interesting. Not going to get into it more than that. But the FX 6100, you know, we just have to look at the numbers, and the numbers are clear. Firstly, the top end Phenom 2X6, which only did 3.4 gigahertz, if I remember. We can look this up here. Phenom. Yeah, so the top end is really a 1090T. We never really got any 10, like 1100s were just pointless. That was doing 3.6 gigahertz if you were lucky on a good day. And that's a black edition. I don't know what the original had, but really they were struggling to push that envelope in terms of core clocks, and that's totally fine. Like, you know, what do you expect? But again, the 6100, and by the way, the top ends were about $300. That was really the point I'm going for. These were $300 when the 6100s came out, which, you know, weren't the best CPUs. Like the 6300 came out just a year after that. But yeah, the 6100s were $165 MSRP. So there you go. It's a half priced. The overclocking headroom with the 6100s was incredible. You could hit 4.5 gigahertz, no problem. It had old motherboard support, so you know you could just plug and play. Hey, I got a Phenom 2X3, let's say, which was a real thing back then. You could, you know, you had I could look here. If you look in the Phenom section, you know, a lot of people were running, you know, Phenom 2X2s. Some people were running X3s. This was like your bare minimum for gaming at that time. If you still played Crysis, if you played, you know, any kind of like CS games, like single-threaded stuff, the X3s just did fine. Most gamers went for the X4s because they were like direct competitors with the Core 2 quads and some early i5s. So it really made a lot of sense if you were here and you were trying to get into video editing. We're not going to get into that today, but basically there's a huge wave of video editors because of YouTube, because of graphics cards, because of, you know, video editors that started coming packaged with high-end GPUs. So that was pretty interesting for most people. So they were trying to upgrade from the X4s. The X6s were very expensive. A year later, we had half-priced 6 cores. So that was very impressive for a lot of people. And it's exactly what Ryzen did as well. So old motherboard support, you could just plug and play a 6100, overclock the shit out of it, and you'd be fine. And it's just interesting because if you look at what was a really big CPU at this time, or, you know, still making waves, was the Intel 900 series. So this is the 940, the 950, 960, 970, 980, 990X. These CPUs were, you know, 4 cores, 6 cores, but they could overclock really good. It had really big motherboards. I have one. It's a Rampage 3 Extreme. It really started the HEDT. Well, we could call it a movement, but it's really the engineering department. And it was just interesting because the 6100 at 4.5 gigahertz traded blows with the Intel 900 series in a lot of games, and even modern games. So that was really incredible for a lot of people, and it allowed you to unlock a lot of performance out of a you know, a gaming rig that was you know, at first just meant for low-end stuff. And it's very similar to how now you have people with B450 motherboards, X470 motherboards that are looking at like potentially upgrading to get a lot of gaming performance, and they're looking at like a Ryzen 5700X. Like, that's incredible. You got a lot more overclocking headroom, the IPC is incredible, etc., etc. It was kind of the same thing at this time. So that's the mid-range. It just made a lot more sense to go with the 6100 than a lot more CPUs. And, you know, so yeah, that's that. Let's get into the high end now. So like we heard now, you know, very overheating CPU that wasn't a true octo core, but, you know, quote unquote octo core, and so on and so forth. So the FX 8150 came out right in 2011, and it was a CPU that had kind of some issues, but it was the first 8-core CPU for actually ever, other than maybe the Opteron. and it was the first in the gaming section, made for games, made for video editing, made for workstations, and it only costed $250, so that's only $100 more than the 6100s. And you didn't have to go with the 8150, you could go with the 8100, which was a little cheaper. I think it was around $215. And it really traded blows with the i7, the i5 2500K and the i7 2600K. These were the big boys that it was going up against. The 2700K was really just a better binned 2600K, so we're not going to get into that. But the 8150 really, the big thing was the i7s. So the 2600K, the 3770K, and later on the 4770K and the 4790. And what you guys don't understand is that in these early benchmarks, the games that were played were Battlefield 3, Bad Company, you had Dirt 3, you had Splinter Cell, I think, was still being played at this time, and you had a lot of these kinds of games that were, single player, that had, or sometimes multiplayer, that had, not much going on the screen. You couldn't really use more than 2 cores, sometimes 4 cores in like really, really late DirectX 10 games. 11 hadn't come out just yet, or actually had just come out, like literally just come out with this generation. And the truth is that these half cores, there was no precedence. Nobody knew what a core was, to be honest. Just 10 years before that, we had cores that didn't even have floating point operators. So it's very hard to say that these people meant any kind of intention to say, okay, well, a core has to be an Intel Core I type core, right? This is something that only started happening around 2015, and that's when people started feeling ripped off. But in fact, when it first came out, there was no precedent to say that it wasn't a true quote-unquote octa-core. Now, let's look at octa-core specifically. Why am I putting that in quotes? Well, why is it called an octa-core? We don't call it an octa-core now. We call it an 8-core, 6-core, quad-core. We still call it quad-core. Why is that? Well, it's actually, it's an Intel nomenclature that just kind of went off the rail there. What am I saying? I just mean that people liked it. When the Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad era came out, it was actually AMD that was going with the X4, X2 nomenclature, and the reason why they did that was because you were getting double the performance. That was like the marketing scheme over there. Obviously, you weren't getting double the performance because most applications couldn't use more than a core, but when you could, it was actually very interesting. It's when the Core I series came out with the Duo and the Quad, people just liked that. It's a quad core. It's a quad core. And so octa-core just came out of that naturally. It was also called a hexacore for the 6000 series. But if you ever hear that, that's a guy that really came out of this kind of era. Nowadays we only say 6-core, 8-core, 10-core. I mean, there's so many variants, it doesn't really matter. But the thing is that the FX 8150 was really going up against, with its 8 cores, against the 2600K. And the only difference between the i5 and the i7 at this point was the hyperthreading for these kind of like mainstream platforms, let's call it. And the hyperthreading sucked. Most applications could not use hyperthreading properly. Actually, it was sluggish. And when we look at like people that were overclocking at this time, that were using kind of quality heat sinks, that was the thing back then. You had to buy quality heat sinks just to do your overclock. Or people that were getting into custom loops, which were pretty new, but again, some people were getting into that. They started realizing that in fact the i5s were better at overclocking, which means they were just better, like full stop. Obviously with the 2700Ks, I think a couple of people started bidding them, and they realized that those even had a bit more overclocking headroom. But with the 2500Ks, you were totally fine. And in terms of pricing, if you looked at it as a customer, you get a FX 8150 or an 8120, which was cheaper than the i5s, and you overclocked it to 4.6 gigahertz or thereabouts, and you had yourself a i7 killer because most games couldn't use more than 2 cores. So that was actually really impressive. All right, it wasn't, it's nothing you should knock out of the table. But again, it gave that precedence, it gave that tincture of AMD that was already building up, which was that AMD is now a low spec gamer type CPU, and it was no longer a high quality CPU that it was back in the Athlon FX days. And again, that's what this guy's saying right at the beginning of the quote. I mean, you could take out all of this garbage and you just look at this little part, and he's totally right. So, again, the 8150 was $50 cheaper, which is a huge, in terms of percentage. It's, what is that? It's like 20%, 30% cheaper. But you have to also consider that versus the 980X and pretty much the 900 series, most of the 900 series, it was actually $400 cheaper. So that was very impressive. It was also $300 cheaper over the 3930K, which came out just about 6 months later. And this one back then was a big deal. This thing gave you actual big 6 cores, Core I 6 cores, what they say. And it gave you 4.7 gigahertz for a lot of people. It gave you EATX motherboards that I believe AM3 Plus really didn't have at all. But again, you were paying $300, almost double the price for just slightly better. But again, the 8100 was plenty for most, which means that it's no longer 50%, it's something like 60%. And you also didn't need a new platform. A lot of people that had AM3 motherboards, they could just plug and play. And a lot of the another thing is that the AM3 platform actually had pretty good support overall. It had a PCIe 2 x16, but it had I believe up to 4 x16s, so you could run like quad Crossfire no problem on AM3. Now obviously, if you look at like i7 of this era, it was already quality over the Core 2 quads that were still being sold like a year before this. But one board I really like from this era is the Z680 Extreme 11. The Extreme 7. I mean, this was a crazy board. It gave you tons of I/O. Here you got a FireWire, which was really fast back then, and USB 3s. And you got plenty of SATA. There was onboard RAID, which is crazy. And look at all the connections, man. And you had original PCIe, which is just something that only AM3 kept for years. But I mean, back then you could get this, and there's plenty of performance. Keep in mind, the Z nomenclature was really a way to mix your HDT with your extreme platforms. There was already a performance platform at this time, which was called the P5 or P6 platform. That completely got extinguished in the 4000 series. But back then, this was like your main competitor. Very expensive board, but it went up against the Rampage. Oh no, sorry, not the Rampage. It did go against the Rampage 4 at this time. Which is this board. I love this board. It just has a PCIe 3.0, but it kills the SATA, and it's got more RAM that you could put on, but a lot of people just didn't care about that at this time. But it also went against the what's the Asus? The shit, I'm losing my motherboard list. This one, I have this one. How come I'm forgetting? Well, the Crosshair. That's right, the Crosshair. If you look at like the Crosshair 4, which by the way I almost bought this one. Very good board. Crosshair 4 was just fine in terms of connections. Like you get lots of PCIe, and you got a PCI like everyone wanted. But it was missing that RAID card. There was just no onboard RAID, and that was a bit of a deal back then. And obviously the original 5 was just fine. You got the 5 formula, and then you got the 5 formula Z. And the 5 formula is the one that kind of came out with the release of FX, original FX 8100s. So yeah, you didn't need a new platform. Back to that. Um, then there was a huge debate about the heating issues. You could see that in the post. And to be honest, this is like a non-issue. This is kind of like a non-gamer perspective. I think a lot of people were coming out of this era not playing games to playing games because, even your like basic quad core could finally play like actual big games like Battlefield, like Metro. That's another one. And so they weren't used to having like a lot of heat coming out of their desktops, and to be honest, it's never been something that like gamers before that cared about. If you look at like the original Pentium 4s, people purposefully made those things very hot. Because if you want to hit 4 gigahertz on a Pentium 4, let's call it like late Pentium 4, you just had to push out the heat from there. So I think it's just because these younger gents were getting into it and didn't really know what they were doing, and so this heat issue problem kind of arose with the forums. I'd love to get a doctorate and literally just as a data scientist and literally just go through the forums and try to data analyze some of this information. That'd be pretty interesting. I mean, right now I'm just going through folklore. But again, like the FX80, the 8000 series were actually really good on heat. We're talking sub 250 watt CPUs, and even at 5 gigahertz, they were still pushing nowhere near 300 watts, which even today we're not even really moaning about anymore. This might have to do with also heat sinks. So there was a lot of forums that were about just heatsink quality. You couldn't just go with your regular heatsink back then because a lot of them were just basically no name brands. But right when the Hyper 212 came out, that was the one that everyone suggested because it was finally a quality copper heatsink, and it came with pretty decent fans. That was another problem back then. Fans were terrible. Like, I remember this kind of era where you had to watch Linus Tech Tips talk about ball bearing versus sleeves because so many people were buying sleeves and were getting their ass absolutely handed to them in after a couple gaming sessions. So it's actually hilarious to me because now we're looking at it with like AIOs. Just you could buy an AIO wherever you want. Back then there was really no AIOs. There's no such thing. You had custom loops, but that was a new level of complexity that a lot of these noobs just didn't want to get into. And I mean, even today, not many people like custom loops because they're just finicky, and people don't like water with electronics. So yeah, again, what was the point of arguing with the octa-cores? Well, simply put, if you put 8 cores in an era where DirectX 10 could only use 2 and DirectX 11 could only use 4 if the developer really wanted to, I mean, 8 cores, what did that mean for the average gamer? Absolutely nothing. The average website, let's call it a web developer or whatever it may be, absolutely nothing. The 8 cores was really just important for 3D applications, which in fact had a niche a niche movement blow up because of Blender and things like this. This is the era where Blender was getting really popular. And again, like, if you had like Sony Vegas at this time, 8 cores was just amazing. You could not get the same performance with a quad core i5 or i7. Obviously, those kinds of guys would spend the extra cash for a 3930K, and then they would realize that, hey, I could actually do quite a lot with my HDT platform. But I think that again, it's an economic imbalance more than it is or I should say an economic min-max that didn't allow the quote-unquote octa-core FX CPUs to first gain traction with the audience that they were looking at. Because again, if you were getting a low-spec computer, you were probably going to go with like Core 2 Quad or a Phenom, or maybe an FX 6000. And then if you're gonna go for like a mid-ranger, most people probably had the money for the i5 or i7, so they didn't really care about FX. And then if you had a bit more cash to spend, like, you would just put it on a 3930K, and you were a very intelligent person for doing that. So that's kind of where I think the misconceptions with the 8000 came from. So we did the 6,000 and the 8,000. Now let's talk about a marketing scheme that ended badly because Intel gamers were very salty, I believe. And that's the fact that the FX 8000 series, specifically the A350, was actually very future proof. So the A350, throughout its lifeline, had always a $300 price point. This is not something you could talk about for any CPU today. If you wanted to spend $300 on a CPU today, what do you think you would get? You would get a middle of the pack 7600, and you would have to put in a $200 motherboard. That was not the case with the A350. The A350, you could spend $300 on your CPU, potentially with a $50 rebate, because back then it was a big thing, and you could get a $100 motherboard and use your old RAM, and that's it. It was incredible how you could just do that very quickly, and it was incredible how many years more you would have out of your life of your CPU if you did that. The first aspect that really made the A350s excellent for future proofing, and we're talking about between 2012, if you bought one in 2012 and you kept using it all the way up to 2017, 2018, right when Ryzen 1000 came out. And even later than that, because again, I used 8000 daily for many years, even during COVID. And the first reason is overclockability. So what people don't understand is FX had an incredible memory controller. DDR3 2000 megahertz, no problem. CL8, CL9 was very doable. It would push out to 2600 megahertz, no problem, on 2 GB RAM sticks. And this is something I've been trying to do with mine. I was looking for what is that called? Corsair Dominator GT RAM, which is really the excellent 2 GB variant RAM. It was around 2010 when they came out with those, and the GT2s could be flashed on the RAM at that time, which is pretty funny because you probably never heard of that flashing RAM. But the RAM overclocking was excellent, and that's a big thing today where people don't understand that what's making your CPU slow is actually your RAM speeds and your latency in terms of games. The next part is the core overclocking. The core overclocking with FX was incredible, really good. This is the first CPU that would hit 5 gigahertz on a consumer platform. Obviously, the Intel 900 series beat to it, where you could actually do 5 gigahertz, 6 cores, etc. But for most people, 5 gigahertz was unheard of, absolutely unheard of. And when you could do 5 gigahertz, 5.1, and some people 5.2 gigahertz on a mainstream $300 CPU, and you were beating out your i7s and some i5s, it was just absolutely incredible, unheard of. And it took many years before the 2500K guys figured out that 5 gigahertz was also possible with very high voltages. But the reason why the core was so high is, firstly, you had no delidding process needed. So the actual the lid of the CPU's chip was soldered on, excellent quality. I do remember some videos where people were buying 9590s. This was early delidding, so like 8700K era. They were buying actually 7700K era even. They were buying old 9590s and they were trying to delid it, and that was pretty funny. But again, delidding, it was the actual architecture. It was built for server side. It was made to run very high voltages and really not have an issue, and that was because these old motherboards had to these big old server motherboards had to run a lot of voltage through these CPUs. And so these CPUs could run tons of voltage. I mean, 1.6 gigahertz, no problem. And you can quote me on that. That is no problem. I mean, so long as you're not running 1.7. But even at 1.7, you could see people do that, and it was, relatively acceptable with the proper liquid cooling. So that's an incredible portion of FX that people don't understand. It's just running stable voltages, unheard of on Intel. The Intel fans were very mad, especially during the 4000 series. Um, and finally, the North Bridge overclocking. So this is a hack that people didn't really understand back then, but the cache speed was actually not attached to the CPU's clock. So with like Intel, especially the Core i series, this was a factor that was always built in. But with AMD, especially the FX series, you did definitely you had to basically overclock your motherboard's chip, because it made your cache faster, and this was a huge benefit for the memory overclocking. But just generally speaking, the IPC you were getting out of that, you were just getting a better board. So for instance, mine, I was running it at 20. Well, stock it runs 2200 megahertz on the North Bridge, but when I started running it at 2600, 2800 megahertz, I was getting quite a lot better 1% lows on pretty much any game I would play, and it was noticeable. It was like, like latency booster basically. The next portion of A350 was the board selection. So this is something that a lot of people didn't realize because they were just now coming into Core i series. But when Core i series came out, the boards were extremely deluxe. And that's because they were trying to bring people from the Core 2 era into the Core i era. And in fact, a lot of people found that Intel was being super cheap on them. Even early on, they were like, why would I buy an i5 750 if I have a Core 2 quad already? Core 2 quads are cheaper, the platform's more stable, etc., etc. It was really a cash grab for Intel to pour more money down in their later technologies. In their server technologies, they were able to make Xeon Phi, etc., etc., but the average mainstream consumer just wasn't having it. They didn't like that very much at first, and then because of these new kids coming on, the new kids on the block, didn't understand FX very well. They thought, Core i's better bang for buck, I might as well just buy those. That's pretty much what happened. But the board selection with the AM3s just had better features, and they had longer lasting features. I mean, if you're looking at like late Intel 4000 series, you're talking about like 4 SATA connectors if you're lucky. You're talking about like an M SATA instead of 2 PC, like full-fledged PCIe slots. It was really, really sparing in terms of features on the board, and that's not even getting into the VRMs. You saw a Crosshair VRM. It's incredible how powerful they are, how much voltage you could push out of them, and just like clean voltage. And then with like Intel 4000, it just wasn't the case at all. Just absolutely terrible. Even people on like Intel 3000 era, they just couldn't find, they had to find old boards because the Z77 was really expensive for the nice boards and just terrible on the cheap boards. And that just was the case with Intel. That was the state of Intel at that time. Crossfire and SLI, no problem. That was another factor that back then it was kind of important. A lot of games you could run a GTX you could run like a GTX 680 and it was still struggling, and that's like Metro or Battlefield or whatever it may be. A lot of people were getting into multi-monitors because old LCD monitors were getting cheap, and that was pretty impressive for a lot of people. And so Crossfire and SLI was more and more in the talks, especially like Far Cry 3 era. And so with FX processors, a lot of the gaming boards, the AM3 Plus boards, had SLI and Crossfire already built in. With the Z680 boards, there was some 770. It was getting rare, and then in the 4000, it was just ridiculous. You couldn't even get like, even like 3 boards that could do that stuff. So it's just incredible. Like they were really, really sparingly giving these features, and you know what? It was just a license fee. I don't know why they didn't just do that. But of course, at the very tail end of FX's lifespan, which was right around Devil Canyon and Skylake, they weren't really able to compete that much. They tried to tune it and get the 9370 and 9590 series, and those just weren't very good. Although they were pairing them up with AIOs, which was incredible and very cool because it was cheaper than the i7 and you got an AIO, and the deal made a lot of sense for a lot of people. But again, this is the era where you could buy a Pentium G3 G3258 and that Pentium would absolutely demolish the FX 8000 series in those old games, because you could push them at 4.7 gigahertz with an actual unlocked core. So that was something that, you know, the i5, well, the original i3s couldn't do. It's something that the i5 was even struggling to do. And so that's right when the 8000 was no longer meta for the mid range. Well, it was, I mean, it wasn't in its favor anymore that much. But we got some price cuts, which was nice, $200. And eventually it just went so low, it was $120 for quite a while. Then it made a lot of sense for low spec gamers. And that's really how I got into FX. And another aspect that made FX very future proof was the fact that all of these things went in the favors of the applications and the gaming scalability. So there was a double-edged sword involved in this, but generally speaking, the FX CPUs were excellent at running older applications that were like more workstation oriented, over the Core i series that was more hyper-threaded, which meant that you had to run newer applications that had good hyper-threading scalability. Gaming was the same way. Most games ran actually pretty garbage, especially older games like pre-2000s ran pretty bad on the original Core i series, and it took Windows and Intel quite a while to figure out how to actually like support those kinds of technologies. That's why if you look at like 2011, 2012, like right when they released the CPU, if you look at that kind of era benchmarks, you'll see that the FX CPUs were actually like pretty much the same as the Intels. And then if you look at like modern day, like, hey, let's check out FX now, let's see what it does against like its competitors, you'll see that Intel is now ahead of the game. Yeah, even like 2000 CPUs, series CPUs are better now than ever, and even in the same games, and that's because of the Windows updates and whatever it may be. So in that way, it was a double-edged sword, because you bought the CPU, it lasted you for quite a while, it gave you good scalability, etc., etc., and then you had that kind of like quote-unquote future-proofing that was built into the deal that you were promised, and then it actually didn't end up panning so well. And you would have kind of that bittersweet moment where it's like, you know what? Maybe I should have stayed with Intel. Maybe I would have gone with Intel. But in fact, you saved quite a lot of money just going with AMD. And, you know, if you had waited long enough, you'd go for Ryzen, and you would have gotten just an incredible deal. Like, we ended up going with a Ryzen 1700, and that was an incredible deal, and it was just great CPU. It just played everything I wanted to at the time. So that double-edged sword, I think, overall panned out for those who were in the right. If you did buy like FX at like in 2014, and you didn't know about overclocking and blah 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 blah, obviously Intel would have looked nicer from afar. But again, the reason why Devil Canyon was so good in the first place, and why people liked it, was that you could finally hit 5 gigahertz on your i7s. That was unheard of with the earlier gens. So if you're talking about the 2600K was kind of hard. I mean, you could disable hyperthreading in a lot of BIOSes, and then that made like 5 gigahertz okay. But 2700K, just forget about it. 3930K, forget about it. 3960X was good for 5 gigahertz, but with like liquid cooling, blah blah blah. 4790K just did 5 gigahertz out the gate with a Hyper 202. And that was really the party trick that the 8000 series had. But again, it's just good that the Intel's finally caught up to that. Skylake didn't do that, and then KB Lake, and the rest of the story. So that's really where we are with that. That's pretty much everything I wanted to say here. I know it's quite a long video, but it is a tough topic to wrap your head around, because there's a lot of misunderstanding on the internet of where FX was coming from. People don't understand that back then, this is another thing, back then people were not on the internet to look at like what CPUs are doing and stuff. So there wasn't such a thing as like a news press release. This is something that today we get like every year, kind of like Apple. But back then it was just not important why should you check out the news press? And yet here, if you look here very specifically, oh, the FX CPUs had 2 billion transistors, blah blah blah. I mean, this is just a lie, and it's clearly because the server side news, which was a lot more important to AMD back then, came downstream. Sorry, yeah, it was downstream, and then no, sorry, it was upstream. I mean, upstream to the FX gaming processors. So obviously, that information is going to be in that order. And so you get this kind of like weird prejudice-y type information that doesn't really make any sense. And it's just interesting. It's just of its era. This guy probably doesn't play games anymore, or he's playing like VR or whatever. And yeah, it's just an interesting way of looking at it. Here, this guy's running X58. This was me back in the day, running 4.6 gigahertz. That's kind of light, but it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious how we can look back at this and say, yeah, you know what? FX was actually a good deal, and a lot of these people were just didn't understand it, or just weren't in the know. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If I didn't cover anything specific or anything you remember, please do comment down below and let me know. But if you do want to build, like I believe personally that in a very near future that the FX CPUs are going to get a revitalization in the media and in the news, and also in terms of retro gaming. If you want to get into retro gaming right now, and you think about like what kind of peripherals you want, which would be probably like a sound card of that era, and a nice GPU or two, and you want to play all the games of this kind of era where it's like mid 2000s to 2015s ish, then I think FX is the one that you're probably going to go. It's going to have the widest mainstream gaming applications. It'll allow you to play, even if you wanted to like quick swap GPUs and try them out. FX will have the widest variety of them, other than maybe X58, which will give you quad SLI. That's something that like 2 games support. But if you wanted those 2 games, X58 would be kind of nicer. But yeah, it's just an incredible platform, and I'll always cherish it. I will definitely buy more motherboards for this kind of era. Even Intel side, I wouldn't really mind it, but again, FX was just crazy. On the flip side, was it better, and this is a question I want in the comments, you guys might want to comment, was it better to go with Intel? If in fact it took Intel almost 5 years to go to multi-core, would it have been better to just go with Intel in the first place? Question for you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Have a great day.